F1 is back on yet another historic track, where the top 3 is unpredictable and weather could really change the race we could have. We make our way to the Canada GP. One of the most historic tracks that Formula 1 has ever had is the Canadian Grand Prix. The moments here are endless, and with the weather being as unpredictable as it is, it has made for some of the most entertaining Grand Prix we've ever had. This track does hold the title for one of the most infamous walls on our calendar year, which is the Wall of Champions. In 1999, we had 3 world champions going to this wall, Michael Schumacher being one of them, and just solidifying the name, the Wall of the Champions. In 2007, we had Kubica's horrible crash. This was one of the most scariest crashes I've ever seen in Formula 1, and seeing what happened to the car with him inside of it, with all that rolling and just debris all over the place, is quite the sight to see, and thank God that we still have them around nowadays. But even the safety from 07 to now has stepped up big time, so Kubica would probably be in a much better state if we had the current cars in that 07 GP. But what some people regard as one of the best races ever that lasted 4 hours was Button's record-breaking race in 2011. This race had Button record 6 different pit stops, from it changing to dry to wet, continuously changing through the race that gave us some of the most unpredictable and craziest moments in one session of Formula 1. A 4-hour race is something that we have yet to see since 2011. There was a record of 6 safety cars, and Jensen only won this race on the last lap, overtaking Sebastian Vettel due to a mistake he made on the track that was wet/dryish. We had the victory from Ricciardo in 2014, which was his first Formula 1 victory. Lewis also ended up having one of his first Formula 1 victories here as well. We also had the infamous Sebastian Vettel and Lewis Hamilton moments where Seb ran over the grass due to a mistake, was given a 5-second penalty, and Lewis ended up winning, which he shouldn't have won because that shouldn't have been a 5-second penalty. And we got one of the best pictures, in my opinion, in Formula 1, with Vettel changing the one from the Mercedes to the Ferrari. The track itself is a hybrid between a street and a traditional one, maybe because of the circuit layout makes it more traditional, but with the walls being close, that is where it is a street circuit. The actual road itself is pretty wide, so that's why we see plenty of overtakes here, but the error for margin is very slim due to the walls. In my opinion, this is one of the most perfect tracks we have when it comes to the slow speed corners, having a couple of straights for the overtakes, but there are zones that you can make some difficult overtakes depending on who has the tire advantage, but it also rewards a lot of confidence. This track has a traction of 5, that's due to the tarmac being very nice and clean, and we will have a resurfacing this year, which could make a difference on the bumps. This track is notorious for having quite aggressive bumps, and then obviously those curbs that everybody's talking about for Red Bull. We will have the softest range from C3 to C5, so many are predicting a 2-stop. A 1-stop is possible here. We could possibly see some team go for it. Maybe Ferrari will try and take advantage of it. Maybe we'll even see McLaren, who's been great on their tires. Maybe even Red Bull pulls a fast one, but it's a difficult track to pull off a 1-stop and then actually end up winning the race as of currently with the softest tires, even though the tire stress isn't actually that bad here. But the slow speed corners can stress your tire out depending on how you take them and the amount the drivers are pushing. A 2-stop usually is the fastest strategy here. We saw that in 22. In 23, we had a safety car, so a lot of drivers couldn't fully push, but it was a very close race and it still was a 2-stop race. Both times in the new regulations, we saw Max Verstappen win in 22 and 23. Just barely, I would say, in both of them. In 23, it was much more of a victory, but Aston actually had a lot of pace and so did Mercedes. We had a wet and a dry quali, so we didn't actually get a proper fastest lap. It's going to be much faster this year, but yet again, we saw Max get P1. Nico was going to get P2, but he ended up actually passing the line when it was supposed to be a yellow flag through that sector, and he got penalized on the lap, which ended up putting him down to P5, and Alonso ended up having P2. We're going to see some pretty low downforce wings here because of the straight line, and that is the main advantage you need to use to be able to overtake the cars. This track is somewhat similar to Miami if I could give it any comparison to what we've seen this year. So the teams that were strong there, like your McLaren, could really put up a big fight, and the curbs here could really help out both Ferrari and McLaren, but at the same time hurt Red Bull, but not as much as something like a Monaco. But let's get into the track and go over each corner. Starting your lap at the start-finish line, this is a short run into turn 1, but it is possible to get overtakes done onto turn 1 from the start of the race because it's not as short as something like Monaco. We then go into the slow speed corner turn 2 that is very difficult to get on that rear traction and very important to lap time if you can nail this. It then goes into a bit of a straight into turns 3 and 4. This is where we had that infamous Vettel incident that I mentioned earlier on. And this part of the track can be very difficult. We might see a lot of track limits here, as well as drivers going onto the grass for a bit. We then go into a full throttle turn 5, which then goes into another very slow speed corner into turn 6 that merges into turn 7, which is your sector 2 start and our first DRS zone where we won't see many overtakes. It's very hard. You got to be right behind the car. This is mainly just for teams to actually catch up to the others in front. But then we go into turns 8 and 9. Taking the curbs here is really important, and it's a very tricky corner. This is where I expect Red Bull to be at its worst. Sector 2 is going to be tricky between 6 and 7, even 8 and 9. But that goes into then a hairpin with no actual DRS zone, but it's got a detection zone right after 9. Getting into that hairpin into 10, we will see overtakes here. Having the tire advantage matters a lot into turn 10, but getting the traction out of this corner will help you a lot to then going into the straight, which has turns 11 and 12 that aren't even really turns. You gotta move the car slightly to be able to get it straight lined out for that sector with the DRS, where we'll typically see teams get close but not really overtake, and then set up their cars into turn 13 and 14, which is your wall of champions, and try to get that overtake done, getting into the start finish line where they will have DRS again from the same detection zone that was in turns 8 and 9. Because there is 3 DRS zones, this tends to have some DRS trains, but with different tire strategies playing out, if it is a 2-stop, we could see teams either pitting early or late to try to overcut or undercut these DRS trains to combat the actual DRS train effect. Let's go over the predictions, best worst teams, and my top 5. As for the best teams, I know that this part of it is kind of getting repetitive, but I want to put them in order. We do know that it's going to be your McLaren, your Ferrari, and Red Bull, but who will actually be the best here in order? So let's start off with P1. I think on this track, it almost seems to perfectly suit the McLaren car. While it is a rear-oriented track, that car is super strong in straight line speed. They've fixed the slow speed corners. We saw that even in China. We saw that in Miami again with Sector 2, but their tires are just insane here. I don't think they're favorited for pole position. It's possible, but I think it's mainly in the race where they're going to get this advantage and really solidify that P1 for me. I do think they will be the strongest car here, and with Lando being great on the tires, I suspect Lando to be really strong here. Maybe Oscar will struggle a bit more. In P2, I'm going to slightly put Red Bull over the Ferrari. I really think with the straight line speed, that's something Ferrari is still lacking with these new updates. At least we saw that in Imola. Let's see if we see that again. Maybe the trend goes off in a different pattern now with it being in Canada. But off of what we have, I do think Ferrari is going to be third. By the way, this margin won't even be a 10th though. I think every team has a chance of winning the Grand Prix, and you'll even see that in my predictions. It's mainly just who has the slight advantages in different zones. When it comes to the worst teams, now this is where it gets tricky with the exception of pretty much one team. Sauber has been the worst team, so I'm going to put them there as the worst team on this track. Now, the temptation to throw in even Aston Martin is pretty high, but I do think they've had a couple of lackluster Grand Prix. Their car was literally qualifying P3 like 2 races ago, so it's hard to say that that team will actually be there. They actually suspect to be in the 2nd or 3rd row in qualifying, so let's see if they can nail the setup. I'm not going to put them in the worst teams. I do suspect this is going to be another bad track for Alpine, but with that being said and them being 9th, it's going to be really close between all the other teams. I do think, and I'm just going to go off of the Williams upgrade, the hypothetical that they're bringing that's going to take off a lot of their weight. I do think they're going to be like 6th or 7th here, so I'm going to put in Haas. But it's going to be very close between these teams. It's been close the whole season. I expect it to be the same trend here. And lastly, for my top 5, it is going to be the top 3 teams that I think are all going to be here. Mercedes and Aston Martin are going to make up the rest of the points, but it will be very close. Maybe we'll have a Yuki Tsunoda inching up into the points as well. Starting off at P5, I'm going to throw in Oscar Piastri. I think the tires are going to get him here, and he will have a good race off of pace, but he's going to lose it as the race goes on. But here's where it gets tricky. Between these top 4, pretty much all of them can win. You got your Lando, you got Leclerc, you got Max, and you got Carlos. And going off of the trend that we've had in these seasons, some of these drivers have been better than others here. McLaren has not been good, traditionally at least, in the Canadian GP, but I think their car is much more suited to it this year than it was last year. With that being said, I think in P4, I'm going to actually throw up Leclerc. I think we're going to have a different style of race from him. He's been really, really good. But this is where I think Carlos is going to get the best of him. I'm going to say Max Verstappen is going to be P3 here. I'm going to put Carlos in P2 and Lando in P1. I think it's going to be something similar to a strategy that Lando might use Carlos for that DRS, and the top 4, 5 are going to be very, very close. I could be off here. I suspect Max is going to be very mad and have a awesome run here. I hope we see some nasty overtakes, and I do think we will see that, but I do think those curbs are going to hurt Red Bull pretty badly, even in the race pace, and just overall confidence if the car is on a knife's edge like it was in Monaco, to be able to ride the curbs somewhat better. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a like and subscribe. It would mean the world for me, and peace.